Hi everyone, welcome. I'm preparing to check in on these two red wiggler worm bins. These are what we've been referring to as our buddy bins, and they've been in the foraging phase for the past 9 weeks. 9 weeks, 63 days since we've been giving them no new bedding, and they've been tasked over that time to be resourceful and pick off any remaining bits of bedding that might still linger within the systems. And they've been doing a real fine job. The material is so free-flowing and smooth and crumbly. But I think it's time to treat them to a nice batch of bedding finally after all that time, because we're going to take that nice treat of bedding as well as these two things right here. If you see the perforated cardboard, you already know what is happening. We're going to use the perforated cardboard to segment a section of each container. We're going to put nice fresh bedding in there with some food for the wormies. And then these pieces of plastic can even be used to keep the moisture in those so-called horizontal migration feeding zones. And the whole idea there is that we're going to be trying to lure the worms out of their finished castings into a collection area on the edge of the bin. So that's what we're going to do today. Let's get a glove on, get the systems up on the bench, and get started. So as we go exploring through these two systems, I don't think we're going to see much as far as leftovers of the strawberry and watermelon that they received 14 days ago. After 2 weeks, I would think that that stuff is going to be long gone. So we'll check, we'll see what we see. And, you know, with only paper coverings out here, things underneath the paper don't get terribly dry. So these feeding zone indicators have been holding up for many check-ins now. It's nice that they're holding up so well, but we could just use these as supplemental bedding at this point since we've got replacements. Nice new replacement feeding zone indicators. And while the feeding zone's going to be very obvious, this is watermelon rind. Feeding zone's going to be very obvious. It's going to be in its own little partitioned off section of the system, but we'll stick to tradition and we'll give it a feeding zone indicator anyway. It's almost like stuff has been ejected out onto the surface, stuff that the worms aren't interested in working on. This must be a plum pit or something. And here's like the seed from perhaps a gourd. So weird. I don't remember leaving these things on the surface. I guess the worms have tried and failed to make any use of it, so they threw it out on the surface saying, come and get it, come pick it up, it's garbage. Alright, whatever, we'll exclude them. You know, at some point I can see myself running this material through a screen and just intercepting any larger chunks of stuff, so I've got to just train myself to be, you know, uncaring about little fragments of material remaining in the stuff. We'll treat that as all stuff that can come out in the wash later. Let's just focus on getting these systems set up for migration. Now, there were a few things referenced on the info board, which I made just a quick, brief appearance of earlier, but the gourds over 250 days in service. I did actually confirm that the day the gourds were introduced to these systems was the day that these systems were paired up as buddy bins. So I didn't realize up until just a couple days ago that that was kind of more of a significant day. So now I decided it would be an interesting thing just to keep an eye on. But you know, after that much time being buddied up, even though this one, the system that's maybe a month and a half older, didn't really have much of an advantage other than getting maybe, you know, a couple handful, I don't know, 2 or 3 additional feedings prior to the younger one coming online. So I kind of tiptoed around the middle section, which is where we've got the gourds. But here in the older system, I believe if we're careful, I was very blasé about what I thought was the remains of the cork. You might remember that was also referenced on the info board. So these cork pieces will, these gourd chunks will accompany the worms to their new home. But there was this one object which seemed so distinct in the way the material rebounds when you squeeze it and you press it. And I thought to myself, well, not much material out there behaves that way, and this might just be a little remaining fragment of the cork. So I'm going to keep it with that large gourd piece right there. And maybe it isn't the cork. Maybe the cork is long gone now. For quite some time I was just treating the cork as history. But then I bumped into that stuff there that had that kind of interesting feel to it. So I've been treating it as the cork, but I have no way to know for sure. Yeah, these are all just fragments of gourd. Gourd being a material which, I'll be honest, I thought would go a little bit more quickly than what this stuff is doing. I mean, I do remember feeding gourds in my Vermibag Mini, and this stuff actually got broken down pretty nicely, but I think that that stuff was a little bit thinner. These are really thick-walled examples of gourds, making them super, super tough. This isn't gourd, though. This is mango seed husk. So, okay. We've spent enough time over here in the older system getting everything blended nice and loose and fluffy. But I didn't want to lose sight of the fact that I also need to leave myself a pretty good size opening into which we can place today's delicious meal. So we'll just leave a rough opening here. We'll get back to actually setting up these horizontal migration feeding zones when we're ready to do so in both systems. Here in the younger system, it's fair to expect much of the same. More gourd, no cork, nothing to go hunting for. The gourd here, though, this thing was huge. Well, it still is huge. I've been using another chunk of the gourd as sort of something to slam it on so I can eject its contents. And something like this is gonna just stay with the worms, I guess, when it comes time to move them on to some new location. So yeah, down here where the gourds are being removed from is where the watermelon and strawberry was fed 14 days ago. If we were to find any of that as leftovers, I'd be very, very surprised. And there are good numbers of worms. Lots and lots of them in this system. This is thought to be one of my more heavily, if not my most heavily populated system. So let's, before we excavate a feeding zone, let's make sure we've tilled up and aerated the material out on this side too. Blending all that nice dry stuff out on the surface down into the bedding. I would think it comes through for the worms as a little bit of a shock. They could probably really sense when the material that's surrounding them suddenly gets blended together with a bunch of dry stuff, and that the material they're in contact with is suddenly so much drier than it had been a moment ago. To me, I think those are the times when the worms probably get really interested in finding something more damp. And the batch of bedding I'm preparing, I prepared it earlier, but as far as I'm concerned, while it's sitting there sort of stewing in moisture, it's preparing. It's becoming softer and more damp and soaked through, and hopefully stuff that the worms are going to appreciate, considering all the stuff that they're occupying now has just been blended together with what was kind of dry out on the surface, making everything in here much drier than it was just a few minutes ago. Sorry, wormies. But yeah, I blended this nice big batch of material in my my typical container that I use for storing my prepared bedding, and these are sticking together from the holes that I created in them. So yeah, I've got a nice batch of bedding just waiting to go. I was just trying to decide how big of a migration zone I want to create, because I did create such a nice plentiful amount of bedding. I figured, well, let's use it up and let's make good use of it. Let's just grab half of what's in here, and that looks to me like we've created a pretty cozy spot for the worms to come hang out in, or at least explore, once they can sense the delicious watermelon treat and coffee treat that we're going to leave for them in here. Oh, stuff is dripping here. I got a little puddle down at the bottom. Oops. You can hear it draining. So I guess the moisture in here will have to get sopped up. I'll have to grab some more dry and restock my supply of that stuff anyway. But that looks to me pretty nice. Let's not forget, oops, did I just eject a worm overboard? Oh my goodness. I didn't, but from a distance at first I thought I did. It was just a little piece of confetti, a little piece of newspaper. So let's just bring over these very slow composting objects. At this point they're just going along for the ride. When the worms finally get relocated into a new home, they'll have these gourds to go with them. And oh, there's another chunk of it. And we'll have plenty of opportunities in the future to make sure we didn't leave any behind. We'll explore the material, we'll aerate it, we'll do our best to keep the horizontal migration feeding zone in both systems as tempting and cozy as possible for the worms to want to come over and explore and hang out in, and then hopefully remain in. So I don't know, let's just spread things out here. I figured I would even go the extra mile of providing them with a whole bunch of lovely grit, pulverized eggshell down in there to accompany the feeding, and their staple favorite food item. Now, I did talk about reusing these as supplementary bedding down in the feeding zones. Do we still have a chance for that to happen? I'm not sure it matters so much, but whatever. At this point, if we put some food on top of it, it's now just bedding in the feeding zone. And then the nice new replacement feeding zone indicator can come in right on top of that as well. Alright, that to me seems like something the worms should be interested in exploring, coming to take a closer look at to see what's going on over there. All that yummy watermelon rind. And as far as this stuff out here, we were covering with newspaper for quite some time now, and it's been doing a fine job protecting the material from losing too much of its moisture too quickly. And I almost wonder if the material is already dry enough at this point to have worms that are interested in finding something more damp, more cozy to be in. So I wonder if it's necessary to switch to no coverings over where the vermicompost is. I suppose we could start out by maintaining coverings with the paper and assume that perhaps this stuff is getting dry enough that worms would be interested in exploring something they can sense is more damp and come over here and hopefully like it and stay. So I don't know, we'll stick with keeping these covers on, and at some point if it seems like we're keeping things a little bit too cozy out there, we can always remove them perhaps at the next check-in. But now we are officially done with foraging and in migration mode. So that's it for the check-in, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.